Hi everyone! Today, we are going to make this scene in Blender. We'll start by creating the gemstone, then build the stand, the trophy base, the curve details, and all the supporting elements. I'll also explain why we're using each tool, because knowing why you are doing something is much more useful than simply memorizing shortcuts. And I'll point out a few common beginner mistakes along the way, so you don't have to learn them the hard way. So let's get started.
First, open Blender. Now press Shift-A, go to Mesh, and add Gem. For this, you need to enable the Extra Mesh add-on. The reason we're using the Gem primitive is that it gives us a good starting shape for the crystal, instead of building every facet manually. Now press 7 on the numpad to go to Top View. Then press Shift-Z to switch to X-ray mode. X-ray is useful here because it allows us to see and select vertices through the model. A common beginner mistake is trying to select hidden vertices from a solid view and accidentally modifying only the visible side. Now go to Edit mode. Select the bottom faces and delete them. Now switch to Vertex mode. Select the top vertices and move them. Do the same for the bottom vertices as well. The reason we're adjusting these vertices is to control the overall proportions of the gem, instead of relying entirely on the default primitive. Now scale it along the x-axis. Rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis. Apply the scale. Applying the scale here is important because several operations later, especially beveling, depend on the object's actual scale. Now just move it to the top. Select the edges and use grid fill to fill the faces. Grid fill is useful when we have an open boundary and want Blender to create an organized face layout instead of manually filling every face. Now select those edges and bevel them. Use Ctrl-B to bevel. And select all the edges, then right-click and choose Mark Sharp. This helps us tell Blender which edges should be treated as sharp edges later when we're working with shading. And don't forget to save the Blender file. Seriously, save it now.
Now, let's create the stand for our gem. Add a cube and scale it along the z-axis. We're using a simple cube here because the stand is mostly a clean, controlled shape. There's no reason to make the modeling more complicated than it needs to be. Just make a stand for this gem. Scale it along the y-axis also. Apply the scale. Now select all the edges and use Bevel. Press Ctrl+B to bevel. Beveling the edges is important because perfectly sharp CG edges usually don't look natural once lighting is added. Real objects have tiny edge transitions that catch highlights. Now add another cube for a scale reference. Here I'm giving it a size of 1.5 feet. If we use a real-world scale, lighting will be easier to set up later. This is one of those steps beginners often skip. You might think, it's just a trophy. Why does the scale matter? But realistic scale affects lighting, shadows, reflections, camera behavior, and even how materials can look. So if you're planning to create a realistic render, it's better to establish the scale early. Now select both objects and scale them down. I combined both objects by using Ctrl+J. Then delete that reference cube. Now apply the scale. And we're ready to move on to the main trophy base. Now add another cube. This is going to be our trophy base. Scale it down a little bit and move it into position. Now scale down the z-axis. Also, if we want to scale only the x and y axes, use S, then Shift-Z to remove the z-axis. This is a very useful Blender shortcut. Instead of scaling the object in all 3 directions and trying to correct it afterward, we can simply tell Blender which axis we want to exclude. In Edit mode, add an edge loop. Select the bottom face and delete it. Now select those faces. Press E to extrude. Then press Alt-S to scale it in the normal direction. The reason we're using Alt-S instead of regular scaling is that we want the faces to move along their normals. Now select the bottom faces and delete them. Select the face and press Shift-S, cursor to selected. This places our 3D cursor exactly where we need it. Now we can add a cylinder there. Scale it down along the Z-axis and shade smooth.
Now add another cylinder. Just select those edges and delete the remaining part. We only require those edge loops. So locate them correctly and select the 3 edges. Here I'm selecting 3. Then press Ctrl+I to invert the selection and delete those edges. We only require those 3 edges. Now extrude them. Press E to extrude. Change the selection. Change the pivot mode. Now scale it down accordingly. We're controlling the pivot here because the pivot determines where the transformation happens. If the result looks like it's moving around the wrong point, the first thing you should check is your pivot setting. Add a middle edge loop. Press Ctrl+R to add the edge. Select those edges and scale them down. And scale it properly. Change the selection mode. Select the edges and use Ctrl+B to bevel. Add the edges wherever we want. Now select those top edges.
Enable proportional editing and scale them. Proportional editing is useful here because we don't want to move only one small section. We want the surrounding geometry to follow smoothly. Rotate it on the Z-axis. Make sure to change the transform pivot point. This is another common beginner mistake. Everything looks correct, but the object rotates around a completely unexpected location because the pivot hasn't been changed. Now select those edges and use grid fill to fill the gaps. Press I to inset the faces. Then press E to extrude a little bit. Apply the scale and go to Edit mode. Select the edge loop and use Ctrl-B to bevel. Adjust the vertices if needed. And for this top area, add a solidify modifier. and a subdivision modifier. Adjust the properties a little bit. You can also use Control 1 to add a subdivision modifier. And we can adjust the proportions a little bit whenever we want. This is one of the advantages of using modifiers. We can keep the geometry flexible while we're still refining the shape. Here, I place the 3D cursor in the middle by selecting the faces and using Shift-S selection to cursor. Now we can add a cylinder here easily. Scale it down a little bit, move it into position, and in edit mode, add an edge loop. Scale it down a little bit,
Use grid fill to fill the areas. Now we can add the faces by using grid fill. Select those edge loops and press Ctrl B to bevel. But before that, apply the scale for a proper result. This is worth remembering. If your bevel width looks inconsistent or strangely stretched, check your scale first. It's one of the most common beginner problems with beveling. Now select those edge loops and press G twice to move the edge properly. Then select the bottom faces. Press I to inset. Press E to extrude them properly. And give them a little bit of bevel. Now select those vertices by holding Ctrl and pressing G twice to move them accordingly. Now add an edge loop. Select those faces. Press I to inset. Press E to extrude. Then press Alt plus S to scale them in the normal direction. Repeat this process until we get the details. Don't rush this part. When you're creating multiple layered details like this, it's much easier to build them gradually than trying to create the entire shape in one operation. Now I selected those edges and duplicated them, then separated them. We don't want to keep the entire geometry because we only need this section for the next detail. Now extrude it along the Z-axis. Shade smooth, scale it up a little bit. Now add these cuts using K. Just select the middle edge and give it some bevel.
Now select the faces and delete those faces. We only want to create that curve look. Now select those edges and separate them. We only need that part, and we can duplicate it in a circular manner. Now select the remaining part, delete it. Select these parts and combine them using Ctrl+J. Now select Edge Mode and press F to fill those gaps. Select the bottom edges using Loop Tools. Select Circle. This is useful because Loop Tools can quickly help us turn an irregular edge loop into a more circular shape. Here, it's looking a little offset. So select those edge loops and press Shift+S, cursor to selected. Then here, I selected the part which I want to align and press Shift+S, selection to cursor. This lets us align the geometry to the cursor position. So scale it up a little bit accordingly. Select those extra faces and delete them. Now add an edge loop and make it circular. Add another edge loop. Select those faces, extrude them. Use Alt+S to scale them in the normal direction. Select those edges and bevel them. Now select the top face and use Shift+S, selection to cursor. This is another place where the 3D cursor saves us time. Now we can add a round cube there. Scale it down a little bit and shade smooth. Now change the pivot point to 3D cursor, and we can duplicate and rotate it accordingly. This is why setting the pivot point correctly matters. We can create repeated elements around the center without manually positioning every single piece. It is looking a little offset, so we can adjust it in top view. And now select everything. Use Ctrl+J to combine everything.
Now select the side area. Scale it down a little bit. Here I'm adjusting the proportions a little bit. Don't be afraid to do this. A lot of modeling is simply about constantly checking the silhouette and making small corrections. Now select these faces and duplicate them. Separate them. And we don't want any modifiers for this. Just scale it down and extrude. Delete those hidden faces. We don't want those. And select those edges and bevel them. Now, the base is looking a little big, so I'm scaling it accordingly. This is another good beginner habit. Don't assume your first proportions are going to be perfect. Keep checking the model from different views and adjust as needed. Now select everything.
Right-click and convert to mesh so that we can apply the modifiers for everything at once. Now, those extra edges, delete them. Let's select the bottom faces and delete them. And place it accordingly. Select those edges and bevel them. Now select everything and combine everything using Ctrl+J. Now just unhide that gem trophy and scale it. It's looking a little big, so I'm scaling it down. Just disable proportional editing if you want. This is a small thing, but always check whether proportional editing is still enabled before making normal transformations. Otherwise, you might move one part and accidentally move half the model with it. And yes, we've all done that at least once. Now just add a cube. Scale it down. Add loops before that. Apply the scale. This is very important. Now bevel those edges. Use Ctrl to deselect those side edges. Now scale it down. Use Alt+S to scale it properly. Select the side edges. Press Ctrl+B to bevel. Shade smooth. Adjust the angle. Now add another plane. Select those three edges, extrude forward, and apply the scale. Bevel it. Shade smooth. Locate this. Adjust the location of these objects and place them properly. Adjust the location of it. Take take a moment here to check the alignment from different views. Small positioning errors can become very noticeable once we add lighting and rendering, so it's better to fix them now rather than later.
And this is the end of part 1. We've built the gemstone, the stand, the trophy base, the curve details, the center elements, and all the supporting geometry. But we're not done yet. In the next part, we'll continue refining the scene and move closer to the final result. So before you leave, make sure your Blender file is saved. If you're following along, take a quick look at your model from the front, side, and top views and make any small proportion adjustments you need. And if you want to continue with this trophy, make sure to follow and subscribe for more. We can catch up in part 2. See you there!